I'm standing in front of the Robert Burns Memorial statue in Windsor, Ontario. Now, Windsor's about 5,590 kilometers away from Ayrshire, Scotland, where Burns called home. It's one of 60 similar statues worldwide, so what's the fascination with this poet, and why is his reach so global? Robert Burns was born on the 25th of January 1759 in the cottage his father built in Alloway, Scotland. He was the first child of farmer William Burns and his wife Agnes Brown, who later went on to have 6 more children. Robert lived in this cottage for the first 7 years of his life until the family relocated to a nearby farm. The family was quite poor, so from a young age, Robert was responsible for tilling fields. There was no commonplace school system at the time, so as a child, Robert was mostly educated by his father, who taught him language and arithmetic. However, when he was a teenager, the fathers of the village pooled money together and arranged for a university-educated man named John Murdoch to come and educate the children of the village. From Murdoch, Burns learned the liberal arts as well as English, French, and Latin. Burns was known to have been a philanderer in his life, having fathered 12 children to 4 separate women. 7 of those children were born out of wedlock, but through this, it's not hard to believe that his earliest known writings were love letters. In 1785, when Burns was just 26, his first child, Elizabeth, was born to his mother's maid, also Elizabeth. At the same time, he had impregnated a woman named Jean Armour with twins. Despite her parents' wishes, Jean Armour and Robert Burns were married 2 years later, in 1788, and the two eventually had 9 children together. Burns was dirt poor and was seriously considering a job offer behind his wife's back to work as a bookkeeper in Jamaica. Furthermore, he was seeing another woman named Mary Campbell, to whom he dedicated several of his poems, including Highland Mary, and it's rumored that they planned to run off to Jamaica together, as possibly mentioned in his song he wrote to her, "Will you go to the Indies, my Mary, and leave old Scotia's shore?" The two had an informal, unofficial wedding ceremony, and she sailed off to Greenock to visit her family before she left. Hear that? That's the clock. However, what Mary didn't know was that her brother had contracted typhus while she was gone, and when she arrived back at home, she began to nurse him, and also contracted typhus herself, and was dead before the end of the month. Now devastated by the loss of his mistress, and still too poor to go to Jamaica, his friend recommended that he publish the poems that he'd been writing. And so he did. He published his poems in a book now known as the Kilmarnock Volume. It was also around this time that his wife found out about the affair he had, and then her father tore up their marriage papers, leaving Burns with nothing. He made 3 shillings a piece off of this book, which actually contained one of his most famous works, To a Mouse. In Edinburgh, Burns had begun to make quite a name for himself as a poet. He actually encountered a 16-year-old Walter Scott, who wrote of him, "I never saw such another eye in a human head, though I've seen the most distinguished men of my time." Speaking of his head, long after his death, when he was exhumed, it was discovered that the skull of Robert Burns is actually much larger than the skull of an average human. In 1787, Burns met a struggling music seller with 2 goals in mind: 1, to make money, and 2, to preserve the rich history of old Scots music. And so, Burns was sympathetic to this goal, and contributed much to the Scots Musical Museum. Burns is responsible for about 200 of the included songs, one of these being the very famous Auld Lang Syne, which was Burns's lyrics put to a traditional Scottish tune. The song can be heard at Hogmanay year after year, and is one of the top 3 most recognizable songs in the English language, as recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records. When he returned home from Edinburgh in 1788, he rekindled his relationship with Jean Armour, who in his absence had given birth to a set of his twins. The two settled their family again on a farm, but knowing how difficult farming can be and how unsuccessful he had been in the past, he took up a second job as a tax collector. 3 years later, Burns recognized how much more fruitful this profession was than farming, and so he gave up the farm and moved to Dumfries. It was around this time that Burns wrote Tam O'Shanter, one of his longer works, the epic tale of a drunken farmer who, while leaving a pub, walks past the local haunted church and sees a group of witches dancing around the devil playing bagpipes. Being drunk, Tam essentially catcalls one of the witches, who chases him and his horse down, and he narrowly escapes. Interestingly, this is one of his many poems that was written in Scots and English, making it quite an interesting read. For example, "Well done, Cutty Sark," and "In an instant all was dark." Not all of his poems were written on pieces of paper or in books. In fact, a lot of them were just scribbled on whatever was near him. He often didn't even give them a title. One such poem was scribbled on the back of a banknote when Burns was considering emigrating to Jamaica. And it goes, "We worth thy power, thou cursed leaf, fell sore so on my woe and grief. For lack of thee I've lost my lass, for lack of thee I scrimp my glass. I see the children of affliction, unaided through my cursed restriction. I've seen the oppressor's cruel smile amid his hapless victim's spoil, and for thy potence vainly wished to crush the villain in the dust. For lack of thee I leave this much-loved shore, never perhaps to grieve old Scotland more." In this poem, Burns directly speaks to money and his lack thereof, and blames it for many of the hardships in his life, including the loss of his wife. He alludes to his intention to depart for Jamaica and presents the idea that the money is winning if it causes him to uproot his life. This poem is slightly ironic based on the fact that it is written on the back of a 1 guinea note, which between 1786 and today is now worth about £75 or approximately $150. Burns's present-day influence extends worldwide. Burns clubs exist all throughout the world which celebrate and recite his poems, and also celebrate Burns suppers on January the 25th, which is celebrated by reading his poetry and of course eating haggis. Also, it's worth noting that Robert Burns has more monuments dedicated to him throughout the world than any other non-religious figure, only after Queen Victoria and Christopher Columbus. In fact, you probably have one near you right now. Today, one can visit the home in Alloway where he was born, which now exists as the Burns Cottage Museum. More has been dedicated to him than monuments, though. In 2008, Coca-Cola produced the first ever commemorative bottle of Coke, which had Robert Burns' face on the front of it. His far-left political views have garnered a lot of attention over the years, and he's been likened nowadays to Che Guevara. In fact, there must be some connection, because in 1956, the world's first commemorative Robert Burns postage stamp was created in not the United Kingdom, but in the Soviet Union. His poems have also traveled more than any other poet's work. In 2010, astronaut Nick Patrick took aboard the space shuttle with him a book of Robert Burns' poetry, which completed 217 orbits of the Earth, spanning a trip of over 5.7 million miles. Although his death is shrouded in mystery, it is known that Robert Burns died at the age of 37 in Dumfries, Scotland in 1796. It's not fully known why he died so young, but it is commonly believed that he died of a blood infection following a recent dental extraction he'd had. And many of the great poets and novelists that came after him did take influence from his work. Notably, the title of the John Steinbeck novel Of Mice and Men comes from a line in the Burns poem To a Mouse, which goes, "The best laid schemes of mice and men gang aft agley," which basically goes to say that even the best thought out plans can go wrong. He also had some very famous fans. US President Abraham Lincoln adored Burns' work and frequently broke out into reciting it at the table in the White House. Another noteworthy fan of Robert Burns was the King of Pop, Michael Jackson. He actually went as far as to create a musical album setting Burns' classical poems to contemporary music. Furthermore, it's even speculated that Jackson's hit Thriller was based off the events depicted in Burns' poem Tam O'Shanter. Personal connection time. This is the site at which Burns' parents met. Now, there is a plaque on this building commemorating this, and this shop for many years was run and operated by my second cousin, once removed, Willie Ross the Butcher. Additionally, there was a sandstone statue of Burns' head on the roof of this building looking out over the street, but it was stolen many years ago. This is the haunted church at which Burns' poem Tam O'Shanter was set. Now, it has been dilapidated for centuries and likely hasn't changed much since the days when Burns used to walk past it. This is why it would have been considered haunted then, and is definitely seen as haunted now. Burns truly was the people's poet. He wasn't an upper-class philosopher who sat around writing poetry in his spare time. He did it because he had to. He made a living off of his poems, and he knew his audience quite well. He wrote to entertain, and he wrote for people just like him, the poor farmers who just needed an escape at the end of their day. Though his influence spans far and wide, in his life, his wealth never really grew. It's estimated that at the time of his death, Robert Burns had approximately £1 to his name. Now, in today's money, that equates to around £80, but still, that's nothing to someone who had such an impact on the world we know. His legacy lives on today because of just how effective his writing was. He was able to easily communicate complicated ideas and emotions in just a few words. It's clear that he's still very much relevant today. In 2009, STV, Scottish Television, conducted a poll that ranked Burns the #1 greatest Scot of all time. Now this is interesting because he beat out famous greats like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, and even Doctor Who star David Tennant. He also beat out famous Scot Sir Alexander Fleming, who invented penicillin and ultimately has prolonged the lives of millions to this day. So there you have it. For centuries, the Scots have settled every corner of the globe and brought the influence of their national poet with them. After all, a man's a man for all that.